Over the centuries, the British monarchy has been shrouded in mystery, protected by an aura of power and tradition that transcends generations. But what if these rituals and traditions concealed a much older and darker secret? Something that not only sustains the crown, but demands a terrible price from its rulers. The unexpected rise of King Gary has brought unsettling revelations to light, revelations that few dare to discuss, but completely change our perception of what truly happens behind the palace's closed doors. You may call it paranoia. I call it vision. This is Light, better known as L, and together we will break the code they've hidden from you. But remember, every shared discovery illuminates new minds. Why did Elizabeth II's death leave more questions than answers? And what does it truly mean to bear the weight of the crown in a monarchy sustained by such deep secrets? The night seemed like any other celebration. In the golden halls of Buckingham Palace, the chandelier's lights cast warm reflections on the crystal glasses and the cautious glances of British aristocracy. These dinners are always the same: luxury on the outside, tension on the inside. It's like everyone there is waiting for the moment to tear into each other. The new king, Gary, occupied the head of an imposing table, surrounded by members of the political elite and high-ranking nobles. Yet, something about the atmosphere transcended luxury. The air seemed heavy, as if an invisible tension was on the verge of breaking. King Gary, a man unprepared for royalty, seemed out of place. He lacked the traditional charisma expected of a monarch. His eyes, however, carried a weight few could comprehend. That dinner, supposedly a tribute to the new ruler, became the stage for one of the most disturbing confessions in the monarchy's history. But what could drive a king to break centuries of silence? He began to speak, not with the pomp expected of a royal speech, but with a trembling voice, laden with emotion. His words were hesitant, as if each sentence was a battle against fear. He didn't wait for the toast or the customary speeches. "The Queen didn't die as you've been told," Gary said, casting a piercing and defiant gaze at those present. The impact was immediate. Glasses were lowered, whispers ceased, and an aura of disbelief spread through the room. The king's words carried a burden he could no longer bear. He revealed that Elizabeth II knew the rights, the secrets that had sustained the monarchy for generations. But it wasn't just about tradition or hierarchy. According to Gary, there was something darker that transcended politics and history. She knew about the pact, he revealed, as the surrounding silence became almost oppressive. But what was this pact? How could it be so vital and yet so terrifying? The story unfolded like a nightmare. He recounted that Elizabeth had mentioned, weeks before her death, strange signs, disturbing visions, shadows that seemed to watch her even in broad daylight. What could these shadows be? Metaphors for guilt and responsibility? Or something far more tangible, something that defies reason? Gary believed the latter. It wasn't just about ruling, he explained. It was a burden none of us should carry. The aristocracy, accustomed as they were to secrets and conspiracies, was visibly uncomfortable. Those who lived alongside power now faced the possibility that everything sustaining the crown was something they could never have imagined. There was a palpable fear in the room. What else could be hidden in the recesses of the palaces, far from the public's prying eyes? Gary paused. His gaze, now resolute, swept across the faces at the table. Every word seemed torn from his memories, a story he didn't want to tell, but felt compelled to share. She knew her time was coming, and she knew there was no escape, he said. His words carried an almost unbearable weight, a truth that hovered like an invisible shadow over everyone in the room. He began to describe Elizabeth's final moments, not as a monarch dying peacefully surrounded by family, but as someone battling forces beyond her comprehension. "You think you know the story," he said, "but everything you've been told is a lie." How would it feel to discover that the narrative of an entire lifetime was constructed to conceal something so dreadful? As Gary spoke, fear turned into morbid fascination. Everyone in the room wanted to know more, but dreaded the next revelation. "She didn't die in her sleep," he declared. "She was taken." But taken by whom? Or by what? The answer, he said, lay in the rights, in the secrets that sustained the monarchy's very existence. With each sentence, the tension escalated. What Gary described was more than a conspiracy. It was a meticulously crafted system where every piece had its place, but where the cost of stability was horrifically high. Elizabeth paid the price, he said. And now, it's my turn. What did he mean by that? Had he discovered something that put his own life at risk? At the end of his confession, Gary's words brought no relief. Instead, they left a void, an absence that could only be filled by the whole truth. But how many in the room were truly ready to face that truth? The question lingered in the air. What really happens behind the golden curtains of power? King Gary's revelation about the monarchy's rights was only the beginning of an even deeper and more terrifying story. During his confession, he explained that the crown is not just a symbol of power, but also a chain binding its wearers to a pact forged in ancient times. The pact is older than the throne itself, he said, his voice filled with a mix of fear and resignation. According to Gary, the agreement was sealed in a moment of desperation, when the monarchy's ancestors faced a threat that could end their lineage. They say you only make a pact like this when there's no other way. Looks like that desperation lasted for centuries, doesn't it? It was then that they turned to something beyond human understanding. But what could be so powerful as to influence centuries of history? He described these forces as entities that existed before religion, before nations. Were they forgotten gods, demons, or something even more unspeakable? The royal lineage, as Gary recounted, was chosen not by merit or divine destiny, but because their lives were a form of currency. The pact ensured the monarchy's longevity, but demanded a terrible price: the complete submission of those who ruled. The crown is not a gift, he said. It's a curse, passed from one ruler to the next. The most chilling part of his confession was the mention that the pact was not merely symbolic. It involved a physical ritual performed in a secret chamber hidden deep within the palace. Gary detailed the first time he was taken to this place. It was an ancient room, built of black stone, smooth as glass, but cold as ice. At its center stood an altar where the rite was performed. You feel the air change down there, Gary explained. It's heavy, as if every breath is an effort. He described the sensation that something invisible was watching them, something that didn't belong to this world. Was it paranoia, or did he truly feel the presence of the entities sustaining the pact? On the altar was a chalice. It wasn't made of gold, silver, or any known metal. It seemed to glow from within, Gary said. Inside the chalice was a thick, dark, pulsating liquid. It wasn't wine. It wasn't anything I could recognize. He revealed that the substance was an essential part of the ritual, and that every monarch had to drink it. But what was this liquid? The blood of the entities or the essence of their predecessors sacrificed. He hesitated. I refused, he said, his voice almost a whisper. But Elizabeth, still alive at the time, warned him, not yet, but your time will come. Those words had echoed in his mind ever since. He understood that his refusal didn't mean freedom. It only postponed the inevitable. The aristocracy in the room remained silent as Gary narrated. Were they complicit in this pact unknowingly, merely by benefiting from the power it sustained? That question hovered over the table like a dark cloud ready to burst. Was the pact solely the king's burden, or did everyone surrounding the crown bear part of the guilt? Gary described Elizabeth's expression during the ritual. There was no glory or dignity in her eyes, only fear and resignation. She knew the pact had consumed her, he said. She knew her life was no longer her own. Was this the real reason behind the Queen's reserved behavior in her final years? Was she battling something far greater than human eyes could perceive? The most unsettling revelation was that the pact was not immutable. It could be broken, but at devastating consequences. She told me that if the pact is broken, chaos will return, Gary stated. But what would that chaos be? The destruction of the political system? Or something far darker and apocalyptic? He concluded by explaining that the only way out was to abdicate. But even that came at a price. The crown is a chain, he said, and whoever tries to free themselves risks dragging everyone into the abyss. It was impossible not to wonder, was this the real reason so few monarchs have voluntarily abdicated throughout history? As he finished, Gary looked around. His eyes, dark and resolute, met every face in the room. "You think power is eternal," he said, "but it comes at a cost, and someone always pays for it." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have a weight of its own. Had everyone finally grasped the gravity of the king's words? King Gary's words about the pact shed light on a terrifying aspect of monarchy, the personal cost to those who bear the crown. At first, it seemed like a story of sacrifice, but as he revealed more, it became clear that the price was far higher than anyone could imagine. "It's not just a responsibility," he said. "It's a burden that consumes everything you are." Gary spoke about the signs Elizabeth began to notice in her later years. These weren't just signs of aging or fatigue. He mentioned subtle, almost imperceptible changes, like the darkening of her veins or the strange glint in her eyes. Were these physical indications of the pact exacting its toll? Or were they manifestations of what he called the power within her, beginning to wear out? He described the moment when the Queen confessed to him that she knew her time was running out. She said she felt the shadows closing in. Gary recalled, his voice low and grave. These shadows, he explained, were not a metaphor. They were real presences, visible only to those marked by the pact. But what were these entities? Were they guardians of the agreement or the debt collectors themselves? She knew there was no escape, Gary continued. She told me about sleepless nights when she felt something in the room with her, watching. Imagine being the most powerful person in the world and not being able to sleep out of fear of what's staring at you in the dark. Ironic, isn't it? The idea that the Queen, one of the most powerful people in the world, lived in fear during her final years was both fascinating and terrifying. How could someone govern with the constant sensation of being watched by forces beyond their understanding? Gary recounted an incident that occurred weeks before Elizabeth's death. He was summoned to the palace in the dead of night. "She told me she needed to show me something," he said. Accompanied only by her and a few trusted staff, he was led to a part of the palace he had never seen before. "It felt like we were descending to the center of the earth," he described. With each step, the air grew heavier, denser. They arrived at a room that seemed straight out of a nightmare. The walls were made of black stone, smooth and without visible seams. In the center was a pit, an abyss so deep that even with lights, the bottom was invisible. "She told me this was where it all ends," Gary said. What he saw around the pit was even more disturbing. Ancient symbols etched into the floor in patterns that seemed to shift when stared at for too long. Elizabeth explained that this pit was the final destination of all monarchs. "It's where we pay our debt," she said, her eyes fixed on the darkness below. But what exactly did that mean? Gary asked what happened when someone was taken there. "She said the pit devours everything," he remembered, his voice trembling. "Your body, your soul, your existence. Nothing escapes." The description of the pit wasn't just physical. Gary felt something emanating from it, a force that seemed to pull not just the body, but also the mind. "It's as if it knows who you are," he said. But who or what inhabited this abyss? This was a question even Elizabeth couldn't answer. Were they the entities of the pact, waiting for payment, or something older and more unknowable? After that encounter, Gary said he could never look at the crown the same way again. "It's not a symbol of power," he asserted. "It's a chain, forged to bind its wearer to the pact." He described the feeling of placing it on his head for the first time as almost suffocating. "It's like it's alive," he said, "as if it carries the history of all who came before." But the most chilling part of his confession came when he explained that the pact didn't end with the monarch's death. He said the power of the crown was sustained by the continual renewal of this agreement. "Each generation, the cycle begins anew," he explained, "and every new ruler is marked from the moment they accept the throne." This meant that the monarchy itself depended on this sacrifice for survival. Gary rhetorically asked, "If this is what keeps us in power, how can we call it service to the people?" It was a question that echoed through every corner of the room. The aristocracy, until then silent, seemed incapable of responding. After all, how many of them had indirectly benefited from this pact without ever questioning what it truly entailed? Gary's confession ended with a statement that left everyone chilled. Elizabeth paid the price, but now it's my turn. What did he mean by this? Was he ready to face the fate he saw in the pit? Or was he willing to break the pact, even knowing the devastating consequences? King Gary not only unveiled the secret of the pact, but also detailed the ritualistic process that kept the monarchy bound to invisible forces. Oh, of course, a mysterious ritual had to be part of the story. There's always a hidden altar in some basement. He explained that the ritual wasn't merely a symbolic ceremony, but an act deeply laden with meaning and consequences. They call it renewal, he said, but what I saw had nothing renewing about it. It was something much darker. The chamber where the ritual took place was hidden deep within Buckingham Palace, in an area inaccessible to anyone not of the direct lineage or an active participant in the process. The staircases seemed endless, Gary recounted. The deeper we went, the denser the air became, almost unbreathable. He described how the stairwell walls were made of cold stone, devoid of any ornamentation, as if they didn't belong to the palace's splendor. Upon reaching the chamber, the atmosphere was entirely different. The walls were black and gleamed like polished glass, yet felt strangely cold to the touch. Ancient symbols were engraved on the floor in a pattern that, according to him, seemed to move, pulsating with its own energy. It felt like the room itself was alive, Gary said. The center of the room was dominated by a low, unassuming altar that seemed to be the focal point of all the energy present. Gary described how the ritual was conducted. A small group of participants was present, including the monarch, silent priests, and occasionally a few senior members of the aristocracy. No words were spoken aloud. Everything was carried out in an almost reverent silence, interrupted only by the sound of footsteps and the strange murmuring that seemed to emanate from the walls. The silence was worse than any noise, he recalled. It felt oppressive, as if the room didn't want witnesses. The centerpiece of the ritual was the chalice. Made of an unknown material, the chalice glowed with an inner light, as if it contained a flame within. The liquid inside, it was equally mysterious. Gary described it as thick, dark, and pulsating, as if it were alive. They told me it was the essence of a lineage, he said. But what did that mean? Blood. Something else. During the ritual, the monarch was instructed to drink from the chalice. Gary revealed that Elizabeth had told him her first participation was one of the most disturbing experiences of her life. "You feel as if something is entering you," she said, "something that doesn't belong to this world." This something was said to be the direct link to the entities sustaining the pact, a way to connect the monarch to the power, ensuring their survival on the throne. But it wasn't just the monarch who was affected. Gary explained that during the ritual, those present also felt an energy that seemed to pierce through them, as if they were involuntary witnesses to something far greater than they could comprehend. "You feel like you're being watched," he said, "but not by anyone in the room." This feeling led many to avoid participating, leaving the ritual limited to only those with enough courage. He described a specific moment when Elizabeth hesitated. She knew what she was doing, Gary said, but even so, it was as if her soul was screaming against it. Despite this, she continued. The chalice was brought to her lips, and the liquid disappeared quickly. The effect was immediate. She seemed stronger, Gary recounted, but her eyes were never the same again. What was this change? Something physical or a mark left by the forces governing the pact? Gary confessed that he himself was once brought to the chalice, but refused to drink. He said he felt a chill pass through him just by being near the altar. "It was as if everything inside me was screaming not to do it," he explained. His refusal, however, did not set him free. He knew his moment would come, just as it had for Elizabeth. "The pact doesn't forget," he said. "It only waits." But the most disturbing part of the ritual was the end. After the monarch drank, there was a moment of complete stillness. It was as if time itself had stopped. During these moments, Gary explained, some attendees reported visions, shadows, faces, places they had never seen before, he said. These visions were interpreted as messages from the entities, a way of communicating what was expected of the royal lineage. The ritual ended with the chalice being returned to its altar, where it remained until the next ceremony. But what intrigued Gary most was that no one knew who had created the chalice or the altar. "They say it has always been there," he revealed. This raised a troubling question. Who initiated the pact? Was it something human or a greater force beyond understanding? Concluding his description, Gary looked at the pale faces around him. "You think this is a choice," he said, "but it isn't. The pact chooses us, not the other way around." The silence that followed was absolute. Those listening knew there was no turning back. What Gary had described was not merely a tradition. It was a prison from which no one could escape. King Gary's confession didn't stop with the description of the pact or the ritual. He brought to light an even more unsettling aspect: the constant presence of shadows that seemed to follow those connected to the crown. Shadows that follow you everywhere. It sounds like being a king isn't just about wearing a crown. It's like starring in a horror movie. "They're not just metaphors," Gary said, his voice heavy. "They're alive. They're watching. And when the time comes, they take what's theirs." He explained that the shadows began to manifest subtly. Elizabeth, for instance, mentioned to him that she noticed movements in her peripheral vision, as if something was lurking. "At first, you think it's just exhaustion," Gary said. "But then they become clearer, more present." The shadows had no defined shape. They were dark masses that seemed to absorb the light around them. But what were they really? Gary suggested that the shadows might be manifestations of the entities behind the pact. "They are the eyes and hands of those who govern the pact," he said. But why were they visible only to monarchs? Was it a way to ensure the debt wasn't forgotten, or a means to intimidate those who might try to break the agreement? Elizabeth recounted a particularly disturbing incident to him. Shortly before her final ceremony, she said she woke in the middle of the night to find one of these shadows standing at the foot of her bed. "It didn't move," the Queen reportedly said to Gary, "but I knew it was alive. It knew who I was." The Queen was paralyzed for minutes that felt like an eternity, unable to look away from the presence. When the shadow finally disappeared, she knew her time was running out. Gary experienced something similar. "I was in a library reading about the history of the monarchy when I felt a presence," he recounted. Looking toward the corner of the room, he saw a shadow slowly forming. It wasn't there before, but somehow it felt like it always had been. He said he tried to ignore it, but the sensation of being watched was unbearable. You feel like it's inside you, that it knows all your secrets. The shadows, according to Gary, were most active during moments of transition. During the death of one monarch and the rise of another, they seemed to multiply. "It's as if they're ensuring the cycle continues," he explained. But what would happen if the cycle were interrupted? That was a question no one seemed willing to answer. He spoke of an ancient tradition that indirectly mentioned the shadows. Forgotten texts, locked in royal vaults, referred to guardians of the pact who ensured the lineage's continuity. They were described as formless beings made of darkness, Gary said, but no one ever explained what they truly were. These descriptions, though vague, were eerily similar to what he and Elizabeth had experienced. There were also records of monarchs who tried to defy the shadows. According to Gary, a 17th century king had refused to participate in the ritual, believing he could rule without submitting to the pact. He disappeared, Gary recounted. Officially, they said he was exiled, but secret records indicate he was taken by the shadows. Was this how the pact dealt with rebellion? And how many others might have shared the same fate without the world knowing? Gary posed a question that deeply resonated with everyone present. Have you ever wondered why the monarchy has survived so many crises? He argued that the shadows weren't just enforcers, but also protectors of the pact. They ensured the royal lineage remained intact, even in times of war or revolution. But at what cost? He described a final episode involving Elizabeth shortly before her death. She said that as she walked through the palace corridors, she felt the shadows were closer than ever. She said she could hear whispers, Gary recounted, words she didn't understand but seemed directed at her. These shadows didn't just watch, they communicated in a way that defied human logic. Gary concluded this segment of his confession with a warning. The shadows don't disappear. They wait patiently, and when you try to run, they grow stronger. The aristocracy present didn't dare question him. For the first time, they confronted the possibility that the power they so admired was tied to something far beyond their control. But who were these shadows? Were they mere manifestations of guilt and fear? Or were they truly emissaries of a pact as old as humanity itself? Gary didn't have all the answers, but he made it clear that these questions needed to be asked before it was too late. The most terrifying point of King Gary's confession involved a place known to few outside the royal lineage, the bottomless pit. Located in the deepest chamber of Buckingham Palace, this abyss was, according to him, the final destination for all monarchs who bore the burden of the crown. It's not a metaphor, Gary said. The pit exists, and it devours everything. Gary's description of this location was haunting. To reach it, one had to descend a spiral staircase that seemed endless. The walls change as you go down, he explained. They begin as crafted stone, but transform into something older, as if not made by human hands. The air grew heavier, and a sense of oppression enveloped anyone who ventured down that path. The pit itself was a perfectly symmetrical circular hole, with edges lined by symbols that Gary said were impossible to decipher. They seem alive, he described. They shift depending on where you look. But what impressed him most wasn't the physical appearance of the place, but the energy it emitted. You feel the pit pulling you, like a magnet for your soul. Gary revealed that Elizabeth had taken him there once to show him what he would face as a future monarch. She told me, "This is our destiny. When the time comes, the pit calls us." He asked what was at the bottom, but the Queen only shook her head, as if the answer was something unspeakable. What could lie down there, hidden from all human eyes? The historical records Gary accessed suggested the pit wasn't merely a geographical anomaly, but something much deeper. He found ancient documents written in nearly forgotten languages describing a portal located where the palace was built. This portal was said to be a passage to another dimension, a realm where the entities of the pact resided. But were these texts the exaggerated imaginings of superstitious minds, or evidence of something real? He recounted a specific incident where one of the Queen's aides ventured too close to the edge of the pit. The man was pulled in, Gary said. There was no wind, no visible force, yet he was sucked inside. He disappeared in seconds. According to him, no one spoke of the incident afterward. It was as if even mentioning the pit was forbidden. The pit, according to Gary, also had a sound, a low, constant noise, like the ground itself was breathing. It's a sound you feel in your chest, he said. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. This sound seemed to grow as one approached, becoming almost deafening for those who lingered too long. He recounted that, in his last meeting with Elizabeth, she admitted feeling the pit calling to her. It's not just a place, she said. It's a destiny. She believed the pit was the final point of the pact, the place where monarchs ultimately paid their debt to the entities sustaining the crown's power. But what happened when someone was thrown into it? Gary explained that, according to the stories he had heard, the pit consumed not just the body, but the very essence of whoever entered. You disappear, he said. There's no echo, no trace. It's as if you never existed. This raised the most unsettling question. Was the pit a portal to another world, or a place where existence was obliterated? He described the final ceremony that took place after a monarch's death. The remains were secretly taken to the pit, accompanied only by the most trusted members of the royal family. They are not buried, Gary said. They are delivered. But delivered to whom, or what? This was the question no one seemed able to answer. Gary paused before revealing the most disturbing detail. He said the pit didn't just consume the monarchs, but seemed to leave something in return. There are stories that, after each ceremony, those near the pit report seeing shadows moving, he said, as if something had come out instead of only going in. He concluded by saying the pit was the monarchy's greatest secret, a place symbolizing not just the end, but the renewal of the pact. It's always there waiting, Gary said, and one day, we will all have to face it. His words left everyone in the room speechless as the weight of what he had described spread like an invisible shadow. King Gary detailed the attempts at resisting the pact, stories buried beneath centuries of secrecy. Resistance to the pact? Now there's someone who tried to say no to the contract and found out the fine print is much darker than expected. He began with a striking case. A king from the 18th century who, upon learning about the ritual, refused to participate. He believed he could rule without drinking from the chalice, Gary explained. At first, nothing happened, and the monarch continued his duties. But over time, he began reporting disturbing visions. He said he saw faces in the dark, Gary recounted. The shadows became more persistent until, on a stormy night, the king mysteriously disappeared from his chambers. Official records claimed he had fled, but confidential documents suggested he was forcibly taken to the abyss. Elizabeth also faced moral dilemmas related to the pact. According to Gary, in the later years of her reign, she questioned the nature of the agreement. She knew the price was too high, he said. The Queen discussed the possibility of abdicating, but was quickly discouraged by her advisors. They told her that breaking the pact would bring chaos, Gary revealed. But chaos for whom? Would it be merely the collapse of the monarchy, or something far broader, affecting the very fabric of the world? Gary suggested that the pact was not merely an issue of royal lineage, but a matter of global balance. He explained that the entities tied to the agreement seemed to exert influence over historical events. Wars, alliances, economic crises, he said. All of it seems to be part of a greater game. This assertion raised unsettling questions. Were the world's most important decisions truly made by human leaders? Or were they manipulated by forces few dared to acknowledge? He cited the example of World War II, where the British monarchy played a central role in resisting the Nazi Axis. It was a historic victory, Gary said. But at what cost? He mentioned accounts from royal advisors who, during the war, noted an increasing presence of shadows around the palace. Was it coincidence, or were the entities ensuring the survival of the crown during a time of crisis? The pact's impact was not limited to the rulers themselves. Gary revealed that, according to Elizabeth, those close to the monarch, including advisors and family members, also felt its effects. She said the air around her felt heavier, he recounted, as if the crown itself carried an energy that affected everyone nearby. This raised an important question. To what extent did the pact influence the behavior and decisions of those orbiting the monarchy? Gary's confession also shed light on a modern attempt to break the cycle. He mentioned a royal family member who, upon discovering the pact's secrets, chose to withdraw from public life. They were labeled rebels, Gary said, but in truth, they were trying to escape. However, even far from the throne, this individual reported feeling a persistent connection to the shadows. This reinforced the idea that the pact was not limited to the position of the monarch, but extended to all those with royal blood. Gary spoke about the cultural influence of the pact. He suggested that many traditions associated with the monarchy, such as coronations and jubilees, were actually ways to reinforce the connection with the entities. These events aren't just celebrations, he said. They're disguised rituals. This could explain why the monarchy places such importance on maintaining these practices, even in times of social change. Looking to the future, Gary was clear. The only way to break the cycle was to expose the pact to the world. The truth needs to be known, he said. But how would the world react? He acknowledged that revealing these secrets could cause the monarchy's complete collapse and destabilize numerous institutions. Yet he believed the cost of ignorance was even greater. If we keep accepting this, he asserted, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. He concluded with a grim warning: the entities won't let this happen without a fight. Any attempt to break the pact will bring consequences. His words left those present in silence, unable to ignore the weight of what they had heard. Gary's confession was not just a revelation, but a call to reflection and action. But who would be willing to confront forces so ancient and powerful? King Gary's confession unveiled a secret that challenges everything we think we know about power, history, and the monarchy itself. The crown, a symbol of leadership and stability, was revealed to be a prison of sacrifices and dark secrets. Across centuries, the pact maintained the royal lineage, but at a cost few could bear. Gary's story is not just about the struggle against the shadows, but a call to question the structures we accept without thought. The truth is out there, hidden in the fine print of a system no one dares to question. But if you're ready to see beyond what they show you, like, comment, and share this video with those who also need to awaken. Tell me, what mystery should we uncover in the next episode? Together, let's break the codes they strive to keep secret. This is just the beginning of the hidden secret.